The one that I find really interesting and still to be explored is virtual reality, where a bit like the latest Matrix film or Mission Impossible, where they have these dead sexy screens and you can almost walk into the world of your database and look around it, rather like a gaming machine would allow you with a virtual reality headset to do the physical actions and move your head, in effect, to walk around inside the globe of a database. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about virtual reality. I was thinking the other day, you know me well, Mark, and I love equipment, tools that help us do our job better, be it in handling data or in turning it into some kind of product where we can try and get meaning and understanding out of the data. Now, over the years, when I first started in analysis, I used to draw charts, which are a formal way of displaying intelligence, using pen and paper. I used to use my son's baby toys, the square shape and the star shape and the round shape, to create different icons following some of the rules and conventions of police intelligence and how we create different kinds of charts. And then over the years, I've watched with great interest and been through the life of a number of IT products becoming ever more complex that sought to create those charts for us. And these have always been big business and very popular and commonly used throughout law enforcement. They were always two-dimensional and largely still are. In other words, you can see them on a flat screen, but when you're trying to visualize in your head, for argument's sake, spatial relationships, geographical distance between entities or people on the other side of the planet, it's very difficult in 2 dimensions. And I've always been very interested in looking at, could we display in 3 dimensions or even multi-dimensional to try and have a chart that evolves with time? And I've lectured on that and studied that with great interest. The one that I find really interesting and still to be explored is virtual reality, where a bit like the latest Matrix film or Mission Impossible, where they have these dead sexy screens and you can almost walk into the world of your database and look around it, rather like a gaming machine would allow you with a virtual reality headset to do the physical actions and move your head, in effect, to walk around inside the globe of a database. I've yet to see that, although there are some tools starting to approach that. But what I always thought was, because I believe in looking at the best data is the beginning for good analysis and good intelligence products. A process is looking at the data in its most accurate form, its most original form. And clearly, spatial relationships and other relationships are important, or potentially important, to allow you to get the best possible mental picture to then go away and form a mental theory, a hypothesis about what the data's telling you, be it a pattern or a trend or whatever. So that's kind of my approach. Before I go any further, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I think when we talk about virtual reality, I think you've touched on there's 2 things I'd like to draw out from that. So are you talking about virtual reality from the perspective of it is a recreation of reality to be experienced, something that is kind of, do you mean specifically the medium of VR to explore something? Or are you talking about more abstract terms about how you started about charts and things like that, and I think data visualizations, charts, things of that kind, that's about describing reality in certain ways, isn't it? And you might be able to paraphrase that as a kind of virtual reality, as a kind of subset. So what are we talking about here? Are we talking specifically the technology of VR and using VR, or are we talking about abstraction and symbolism and trying to describe things using pictures or images?
That's an interesting one. I started off thinking we'd talk about VR and the emergence of these new tools. But when I started to think about it, it took me to the other point that you made. It's just another tool. And we are a tool-making species, including in how we take information from the environment and process it. So for me, I'd actually like to go back and talk about those basic principles first, because if we don't, I don't think you'd be able to truly appreciate what virtual reality might offer to you as a potential bonus, but also what some of the pitfalls might be. And I'm talking about a product, like everything here, it's it might be interesting, but is it of practical value would be the acid test for me. Is it something I could use in my workplace environment to actually understand data better and come up with more accurate theories and intelligence products?
Fair enough. So I think we should then let's stay focused on VR specifically, the tech.
Okay.
Then for now, we'll leave the more philosophical, abstract stuff to the side. I'm sure we'll pick up on it. I mean, I've been on a similar journey, I know when I started my analytical career, the process, and I'm oversimplifying this massively, but was here's a bunch of data, analytically try and make sense of it. And I would say you could use those tools that you mentioned in two ways. The tools are either to help the analyst try and break down the complexity, or sometimes once the analyst had broke down the complexity, they had a story to tell, then sometimes they'd use the technology as a communications tool. Might be a slide deck, might be a video, might be a diagram, whatever. I think specifically for VR, I, like you, have always thought about, when we're using traditional, most charts, like graphs, are 2 dimensions. And some of the diagrams that we have, like link network graphs, I think with the formal name, are 2-dimensional. And I've often wondered, okay, are we constrained by having 2 dimensions? And when you make it 3D, what does that third dimension get you? And I do think there's some scope there analytically and in general, but I also think that sometimes the extra complexity and the extra depth that those extra dimensions give you sometimes turns the tool not into a communications aid, but it brings it back more into the realms of an analytical tool for delving, for digging deeper and deeper and deeper into that data set. So is that what you've kind of got in mind?
Yeah. For me, the extra variables I think are really straightforward. Clearly, you have on a 2-dimensional screen, you've got direction on axis A and direction on axis B, like a graph. And those 2 axes result in the value being plotted at a single point on that 2-dimensional piece of paper, if you will, be it a computer screen or a piece of paper. The third dimension, for me, spatial relationships matter. I really believe that. I can remember probably about 20 years ago being very pleased to see a particular crime mapping tool, which instead of having dots on maps, as if you were looking down on a town, actually offered them in 3 dimensions. And what they were using it for was for plotting criminal activity in blocks of flats. So when you look down on a 2-dimensional standard display, you just had a large dot or a number of dots in one location. But when you turned it on its axis to get this dimension of height, suddenly you realised that, for argument's sake, there might be one crime on floor 1 on Flea, one on 53, but around floors 42 to 47, there was, if you will, a hotspot. So from a management point of view or understanding criminality, there was useful information there. And I've seen that used in a different arena with fire services and emergency rescues will go into a hazardous site, maybe where a building's collapsed or there's been a terrorist incident or something awful. And they usually have great difficulty, the machines or the individual officers that go in, to report back exact locations as to where they've been, what they've seen, maybe where they've found a trapped human being or a body. But then they brought in technology that allowed them to plot it in real time, almost like a drone, giving back a GPS point together with a video camera mounted on a headset. So suddenly the users of that data, not the person at the front, the data gatherer, but the command team behind them and the other experts and specialists were able to understand exactly what it was that their drone, if you will, although it was a human drone in the early stages, was identifying, and they were able to create very effective 3D maps of, a building plan's no use, an architectural drawing when the building's collapsed because of an earthquake or some other event. So you have to create a new map, and the only way to do it is to actually explore it with technology or with human or animal intervention like body dogs and things like that. So I think spatial information or the attribute of spatial location is useful. I also think time matters, and I've seen for many years analytic products that are kind of like film products. So what you actually have are a series of still 2-dimensional images of a chart, but then there'll be another chart of the same data a moment later and a moment later in time. And when they run them together fast enough, of course, what you get, just like with film, is you get this illusion of the data and the chart changing. And that suddenly can give you a whole other insight into how something's changing. Now, people who are not analysts would see this, things like graphs changing over time, or bar charts, or weather maps on the globe. But as analysts, we're well used to doing the same with data and seeing the changes in that data over time, because then it might give you some information about a hypothesis that's telling you about how things are changing in time. Maybe the risk is going up, or maybe there's a significant event coming up, or a significant event just passed. So that's two more, as well as the first two. But then the fifth one I call A and Other, because once you've got those four key attributes, three relating to direction, space, the fourth time, the fifth can be anything you want it to be. Just in the same way you might colour an icon or a link line, you can use colour or words or symbols, whatever you want on a particular piece of data or its relationship to give information about another attribute. And rather like a Formula One steering wheel, where the buttons can be customized by the driver, rather like game sets these days, you don't get a handset with 10 buttons that only do certain things. You, the user, can program to do different things. We could do that, and you can have that an infinite number of times. But I do agree that after a while, is that of value to you as an analyst, as a tool? You're not actually doing the core job.
I think that's a risk. And I'll be honest with you, I think here's the thing, right? So I think what we're dancing around is visualization. What are we recreating visually? Are we recreating an environment, in which case 3 dimensions works, 4 dimensions works if you've got a time component? The problem with structured data that I've found in my analytical career is that sometimes you can do all sorts of tricks visually, which at first glance seem quite good, but actually when you scratch the surface are a little bit gimmicky. And actually, I think they add more heat than light, to be honest, to be frank. I think, and because sometimes I think it really depends on what the goal of the exercise is, because I think, can you use either 3D modeling or 4-dimensional VR, or sorry, we should also mention augmented reality, because AR is important in this space, as an exploration tool or as a communications tool? And I think it's really tricky, right? Because I think it depends on how deep you want to go with it. I mean, you brought up a few Hollywood examples. I mean, I can think of things like The Lawnmower Man, Prometheus, Minority Report. They've all got this kind of CGI kind of take on how human and computer interaction might work in the future. In Minority Report, you've got Tom Cruise, swiping virtual windows at speed. I think in Prometheus, you've got this probe that's relaying the cavern in 3 dimensions, and you can kind of see this 3-dimensional representation of the cave that they're about to explore. And that probably goes back to your kind of the firefighting and crisis rescue stuff. But I've also sometimes seen cases where, in movies and in real life, where you can visualize stuff that doesn't need visualizing. Sometimes you just need a spreadsheet. Sometimes you just need a call volume. And so what you were saying about those tower blocks, where, the extra layer of height kind of made them stood tall because, obviously, and I imagine that's based on because they found a way of coping with overlapping markers, right? Because if that was a 2-dimensional map, and if there was a button for each crime, you'd have to lay the buttons on top of each other, and obviously the more buttons, the taller the thing. But you can represent that in a number of ways. That could be that could be a bullet point and 3 bullet points on a crime sheet, right? You could say, this is this month's crime report, and we've had this many here. There's many ways to communicate the same point, and sometimes I think it really does matter that we don't over-egg the pudding. Maybe I do think there are some very niche applications where VR, AR absolutely have value in analysis and in communication, but I think they're very specific and very niche.
I agree with you. I'm not talking here about data communication. I'm talking about tool that would help you or I as the analyst come up with those hypotheses. Communication, yes, they could be used for that, but we know the Achilles heel of complex communication tools is, rather like me with anything to do with IT, if the user don't understand the tool, they can misunderstand. And I've had many experiences, and I'm sure you have too, where experts in other fields or senior managers or officers have said, I don't need you to interpret that for me. I can read that chart. And they completely misinterpret it. and therefore make decisions and take actions that are completely wrong, and then turn around and say the analysis is bad. It's not. It's the fact that they've ignored the expert advice. Just like if I went to the hospital and they x-rayed my lungs and I said, well, I can see everything's all right because I can't see anything on the x-ray. I'm not trained to read x-rays. That's why you have doctors and radiographers. Well, it's the same with analysts, and particularly for communication, I think it's really important. In the same way that we structure the way that we write things, analytic writing is different to, writing a novel or just writing a normal report. The products that we create are deliberately structured to be kind of guarded. But I'm not talking about that comps. I'm talking about what can help me understand the data. And this is kind of where the philosophy things, this is what took me back to the philosophy. You think of these tools, they sound really inviting. I totally agree with you. Just because you have them, like you've got all the tools on a smartphone or a really modern camera, doesn't mean you actually need to use them. I have a smartphone that does loads of things badly. It doesn't take pictures as good as a camera. It doesn't record sound as good as a dedicated recording device. It's a crap phone compared to a better phone. If I had those three devices on the desk, I wouldn't buy a phone. But so be it. So you're right. And as I said at the beginning, I love kit, but loving it can be a dangerous thing. It's kind of like fast food. You become a victim of the consequences of your likes and dislikes. But what I was trying to get to with the issue around the philosophy, go back to first principles. And you know me, I'm a great believer in starting from first principles and unpicking things. We as human beings collect our own data. Primary data in terms of our senses. Our brain then processes that data according to our mental models and creates a virtual reality in our head. And this is I've talked about this many times, the philosopher Karl Popper, his theory of worlds, whereby the senses capture the real world, the first world, that's the physical world if we weren't here, just going along doing its own thing. That's the real world. Then there's the world that our senses capture, which can be affected by distance, relationship, by all the physical factors that might affect us, like I'm wearing spectacles right now, maybe I'm colourblind, so on and so forth. But then the third world is what your brain does with that secondary data from your senses. It's not the source data, it's secondary data already. So your brain creates a mental model, and obviously we won't get into how that works today. So for me, even just walking around, eating your lunch or everyday activities, you're already in a world of virtual reality because your brain can't see or hear or taste. It relies on these secondary data gatherers. So we already know in analysis that you can trick people's vision by showing them certain images. And we've done it many times in classes just for fun that make them think something is different to what it actually is. And that's because the brain and the eyes together are basically defaulting to a preconceived model, and it's not that. If you actually looked at it and when you explain the difference, people can see it. But if we're misinterpreting data, that shows our fallibility. Now, move on to verbal information received. I'm not talking about communicating, I'm talking about us receiving that data. Things like written language. So we've got spoken language, written language, visual diagrams that we used to receive, paintings and maps. Forget analysis, go back in history, we have used visualization to understand and try and capture things, if you were the artist, and also to communicate it if you were then passing that work on. Or am I being really philosophical and out there and need to shut up?
I get where you're coming. No. I get where you're coming from. I think, right, you can make the argument that consciousness is a kind of analogous to a type of VR, right? You could say that maybe in some respects, the creature, before it gets that conscious level, consciousness is almost like the VR headset that it puts on. Yes, it has the interpretation of the audiovisual cues, any internal mental processes are there. So the consciousness is a form of maybe virtual reality in a way, because I think it's fair to say that consciousness is some sort of construct without going too deep into philosophy. I'm saying this as a non-philosophical expert. From my own understanding, I'm aware that my consciousness, some of it is kind of I'm aware of, but most of it I'm not. Most of my processing goes on unconsciously. But I'm also aware that I do have a conscious experience, right? I'm aware of the kind of those signals coming in, those visual ones, the audio ones, and I'm selecting all the time, right? And I'm selecting automatically, and I'm selecting manually what I'm going to focus on, stuff like that. I think it depends on. So if you're suggesting that, is there an issue with actual VR when our conscious state is actually a form of VR? Sure. I mean, we are the human conscious state, for want of a better term, has all sorts of problems, right? The biases, heuristics, all the limits that we'll probably go into detail more in other episodes. In terms of VR, does VR help or hinder those? I think it's a very open answer, but I think it depends. I remember early in my career, I was kind of desperate to kind of get as techie as I could with VR. So, like when I was in the place as an analyst, right, half the time you're just dumped with a folder full of data. And the data can be about anything. It could be cell phone traffic. It could be maps. It could be emails. It could be invoices. It could be all sorts of things. Sometimes it's somebody's personal phone or personal computer. So you've got this folder full of data. And I used to wonder sometimes, if you give me a suspect's computer, and we don't know much about what the crime is. So we don't have the leaders to specifically say, well, we're looking for evidence for this murder or for this particular crime. Me on a laptop or on a desktop PC, browsing folder after folder, looking for file types, going through, okay. I used to sometimes wonder, would it be better to have some sort of like Star Trek holodeck where I could walk around the computer, if you like, if you could somehow visually represent, the content as maybe different structures and go, well, that's a bloody big structure over there. I'll go see what that is. Or that's some weird shapes. I'll go in that. And there might be some scope in that, I'll be honest. But I think the effort to produce that, the effort to explore that, I wonder, once you've got used to kind of just doing it the simple way, with a 2D display, and you kind of build your own heuristics, right? You say, right, I don't know what's in this big box of data, but I'm going to look for, first of all, I'm going to separate all the data into system-generated files and user-generated files. And of the user-generated files, I'm going to look at stuff that was created in the last week or month, or I'm going to look at the pictures, or I'm going to look at the comms traffic. You come up with these heuristic tricks, right, that say, I'm going to prioritize this because there's a million things in here, and I ain't going to look at a million things. I'm only going to look at 100. So I'm going to try and my solution to that problem is to try and triage to that. That's not to say that I wouldn't love an AR or VR solution for that, to say, I do think there is a scope to say, can we visually represent in 3 or 4 dimensions data within a data set of different times in a forensic point of view, or in an analysis point of view. And I think there's definitely scope to use. And sorry, I'm conscious that I think that I have misled. I agree with you. There is a lot of 2D bias, right? Most charts are 2D, most graphics are 2D, because we are constrained by the tech, right? Paper is 2D, screens are 2D. And the second we get to very cheap holographic displays or cheap AR displays that we don't mind wearing, or we can be feeding to our brains directly, as soon as we get past that technological constraint, as soon as we can represent in 3D with little fuss in the same way we represent 2D now, I think you'll see an explosion in kind of 3D chart traffic and the 4D, time. You can add time to, because once you've got 3D, you're right. At the moment, we talk about 3D and 4D as if it's the third dimension's depth and the fourth, the third is depth, fourth is time. But actually, like you said, you can have a 2D sets that change over time, right? And you can just add a temporal component without a depth component. Yeah, I do think there's more to be done with AR and VR, but I don't think the underlying kit's there yet. I think we're at the papyrus stage when it comes to 3D, if that makes sense. We've got AR, we've got VR, but until it's kind of neural link and we're not having to wear massive headsets, I don't think we're going to see any big changes.
I think you're right, and there's something I'd want to pick up on that was really good in what you said that really struck a chord. But my view would be evolution has designed us as human beings to be multidimensional. The world we live in is multidimensional, and it's got complex layers. I'm looking outside right now, and I've got depth perception of the road. I've got movement of people and traffic. I've got wind, which I can't feel on my skin, but I can see it blowing the leaves. I can feel the temperature. So there's all this sensory information. I'm neither angry nor sad, but that could be a factor There's nothing out there that's particularly alarming me or creating a survival reaction. What I'm trying to get at is, here we have been for millions of years learning to function like this, and I'm not criticizing the tech, but to rely on 2D or even written word is two-dimensional, but to rely on that, I think, is artificial. I'm not saying it's not very useful. The second thing I'd pick up on is, you mentioned about looking at the data in different ways when you were talking about the various tests you were doing on your folder of data. I really like that, and we both know that's good practice. But the most intuitive things I've seen, you talked about reorganizing it in different ways, and I would do exactly the same. But the one that always really interested me was kind of like, like the witch doctors who throw up a stack of bones and they fall down how they fall, and they interpret that, or the chicken gizzards or whatever. Now, chances are 99.9% of that is complete nonsense. I've always liked methods that allow you to throw data in the air, shall we say, in an abstract way, rather than saying, oh, this data form or this data group or subpopulation, to try and just look for abstract relationships. And some of the algorithms can do that and have done that for a long time. The problem with the patterns that generates is, just because the pattern is there doesn't mean it has any meaning in real life. It's like statistical significance versus really significant. What I'm getting to is, for me, potentially there's a massive potential benefit in these tools becoming multidimensional, but there's also a massive risk. Firstly, massive cost in terms of time and resourcing and populating it, massive risk in skill, learning how to interpret it and manipulate it and interpret it correctly. But for me, the answer to that is, bring it on. Let's have a go. We've learned to survive with 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional stuff. But as good analysts and intelligence operatives, we always need to go back to the first principle of testing it. And one of the good ways of testing any kind of visualization or any kind of theory is to look for a corroboration by looking at it through a different medium. So, for example, if in my head, rather like going to a planetarium where you walk into a darkened room and you've got all the galaxies spread out around you, kind of like Prometheus, if you could walk in there and you see a pattern in that geospatial relationship in the data, whatever it is, you then come out and go back to first principles, like you say, get your spreadsheet out or get your written text out or get the database and see if it's reflected. That's good scientific method. That's good academic research to go away and test it and make sure that it actually appears when you look at the data in different ways. Because if it does appear, chances are, and again, it's hypothesis testing, so there's always that risk. Hypothesis creation. Chances are you've a higher chance of it being significant or useful versus one where you go away and you find no correlation. The other solution is, or the other potential answer to that result is, not just it's more or less likely to be correct. Is it that, or is it just that the tool that we're using doesn't have the sophistication to come up with the particular visualization? So we need to look at tool or the data set. But that's for another day. Does that make sense?
It does. I think what we're going around, I think, is that what we're calling virtual reality is underpinned by data visualization, right? But the thing about data visualization is, well, a couple of things. First of all, the term data visualization tells you almost nothing. Really, you don't know what the data is, you don't know how it's going to be visualized. And second of all, data viz has been a thing for a long time, and it seems to go through generational cycles of like, get ready everybody, because data viz is going to save the day. Data viz is going to yield new insights. It's going to show you these new things, and it can sometimes, right? If you have two variables on a chart, the relationship between those two variables can be important, and you should stick to that. But sometimes data visualization is limited. Let's throw away data visualization and let's badge it as representation. And I think representation is a different thing. And you can represent anything you like. And I totally with you. Yeah, we break down complex situations and intelligence circumstances into either narrative format, where our narratives don't accurately describe everything that's going on. We can represent those situations in visual format. So it might be through actual scientific charts, or it might be through a diagram or like a network graph of who's linked to who. So we can represent things all the time, and representation is always editorial. It's always descriptive. There's always, in some respects, more loss than gain. And I think that's the thing, right? Is that virtual reality is almost like we can bring more stuff with you, and you always can. There are always going to be situations that can be represented in a more rich way, I think. But I also think it comes also back to communication, in that the exercise of learning, so me exploring data, me exploring a situation, what's happening is I'm changing my internal perception of a situation, right? I'm kind of however I'm doing it, VR kit, sci-fi kit, chat GPT, whatever. But I start at point A with a perception, and then I'm using all these representations to change my view of a given situation or worldview. And at the point B, I have a different set. Now, what I found at the end of that journey might need a completely different toolkit and approach to give to other people. Because the other thing with VR is, if you give them that 3D or 4D exploratory experience, even if presented with the same data, they may not come to the same conclusion as you. They may come to, and that might be a good or a bad thing. There might be some use there. So yeah, I'm not saying that there are massive constraints with pen and paper in 2D. There absolutely are. And I think and tech will change that over time. I think we'll get 3D, 4D, and who knows, maybe with AI, we'll get kind of, all the variables in a given situation will be given due credit and the ability to explore and explain. But there's so, like with everything in Intel, everything is linked to everything else, right? We're talking about language, we're talking about focus and psychology, we're talking about attention bias, all that type of stuff. There's so much there that I think if you go back, like, I don't know, Florence Nightingale, and the original, I can't remember what it's called, did Data Viz, where she's showing the casualty reports to kind of convince the generals about how bad things are. And the visual cue was supposed to have been, the huge big shift. It's like, I get it now. I get it. I'll be honest, I don't know. I know some people are visual thinkers, and some people do need a visual nudge to be, okay, I get it now. But I sometimes wonder how much of that is kind of hyped a little bit, and how much is either, is it an aid to the message rather than the message itself, if that makes sense.
I agree.
Icing on the cake.
I agree with you, but we're still coming back to, which I think is a potential error, data communication, i.e. sharing it with other people. And my view, based on long experience of communicating with customers and trying to qualify and make them truly understand the significance, and I've no problem with being challenged and somebody working through my data and my hypotheses and saying you've missed something or I disagree with your conclusions. That's just good, rigorous analysis and intelligence products. Or even the customer saying, I don't see how it's operationally significant or needing of action in this way at this time. That's all fine. But my experience was always, you are always going to have to explain and provide further information, be it you've submitted a written report or charts or, like you say, some kind of visual presentation or verbal presentation. Questions come, and there's nothing wrong with that. One of the things I always have done when I've got to the communication stage, I've tried to go for not for the fanciest, but the lowest common denominator, almost to keep it simple, stupid process. That's not because I think my customers and other people are stupid, but I'm trying to minimize the chance of them misunderstanding and misinterpreting the product, and therefore not asking me the necessary questions for me to clarify if there is a misunderstanding. Because if you don't know there's a misunderstanding there, you can't try and deal with it and rein it in.
Is there a hazard regarding virtual reality that you're driving at? Is it, or is there an opportunity? Is it there's a danger that we should be thinking about, or is it an opportunity that we're not? What is it about VR or AR that you've got an issue with, and what is that issue?
I think it's both. It's risk and reward potential on both sides, and both are unknown at this stage. I have a big issue with any kind of organisation selling a product, in this case an IT product, because they have skin in the game. So like you say, every time, I remember, God, I'm going back 40 years, I looked at 300 different analytic visualisation tools. Just to try and scope what was out there in the global market. And some of them were basic, almost drawing packages, but they had a validity, and some were the latest so-called analytic visualization tools. Every single one of them, if you said which is the best tool, they'd all said ours is, buy this, you have to buy this because ours is better than theirs. And they weren't. Every single tool I've ever looked at has always had flaws or opportunities for improvement, and understanding that is part of using that tool effectively. It's like having a car. Just because it'll do 100 miles an hour, you need to understand that if you do 100 miles an hour in every situation, you're probably going to kill yourself or somebody else. There's a risk to the benefit. So I think that's the case with VR. But I would say that the case for using any kind of tool for your own data exploration is one thing, and that's down to your own personal skill. And you can then, or your own preferences as an analyst, but you can then check that with other analysts, other professionals who are skilled, to check the understanding, to make sure you're not veering off something that has real value rather than just it being a concept that you've identified that nobody else can and is potentially wrong, rather than you're a really good analyst and you've found the pattern that nobody else can find, the holy grail of analysis. We all want to be the one to find the next greatest important thing to lead to a result. But I think that's different to using it as a communication tool. So with my analyst hat on, I would welcome any tool, but would want to be really risk averse into the way I used it for checks and balances on my own analysis by reverting to earlier, simpler tools for that corroboration, as well as other analysts. But for communication, can't imagine using it. It might be sexy, it might be entertaining, as we see in the latest movies, but they are made for entertainment. They are not made for conveying information. They're there for a dopamine hit, not for a particular point that's a decision leading to action. So there's that kind of double standard. And maybe the two will meet in the middle years down the line. A couple of million years, we'll probably all be virtual reality human beings with the perfect interface, and it's how we work. But right now we aren't.
You know me, I love tech. I'm a tech early adopter, and I will always, sometimes I'm more biased towards using a technical solution, and sometimes I will over-egg the pudding. However, I will say I've kind of come full circle in that on some of the most complex inquiries I've ever worked on, it hasn't been the software that's got me out of trouble. Sometimes it's been a mountain of Post-it notes, or like the old kind of Hollywood kind of wall, when you've got you're just throwing things at the wall and just seeing what kind of, or making your own version of that wall, not necessarily linking things with bits of string, because I don't really kind of believe in that kind of in that way. I think that's where the software can come in hand. I think it's about leveraging the tech to what it does best. So what I mean is, if I'm exploring data and I'm finding little pebbles along the way and think, oh, that might be important. Okay, quick scribble on a Post-it note, right, on the wall it goes. Or it might be a digital Post-it note. Maybe it's on a notepad somewhere. I do sometimes just scribble into Notepad. I still use Notepad to this day, or Notepad++ if you get a chance. However, there are more complex. Now, and you know that the most expensive ones on the block, there's I2, there's some of the other stuff that's out there. Very expensive bits of kit that are, as you are drawing the chart, that making complex relational databases in the background. And sometimes you might need that. If you've been doing that for months and months and months, and you've got so many thousands of entities and cross-links, the ability to just type into a search box, Apple, and you'll find all instances of Apple in that entire set, potentially draw a new chart for you at the click. Absolutely. And that's where the money comes in. That's where the tech comes in. But I think the reason why I kept going back to communicating is because I think sometimes as an analyst, and this is going to be a topic for a different episode, but basically we're into that whole thing of, generally speaking, analysts are the first people sent in to a big room full of data that nobody else has parsed yet. So when you come to a cognition of reality point of view, everybody from a mission perspective is at the other side of the door saying, we know something's in there, we think, we have no idea what. You're going in there, you're going to rifle through all the drawers and books and docs and everything, and you're going to try and find what's in there. When the analyst walks into that room, sometimes you can become charmed by the process of searching, can't you? You go on such a rich experience of going through all these different things, and sometimes you might be overly charmed by what you found first or what you found last, or how impactful a certain piece of information is, that sometimes it's hard to communicate back. And you're absolutely right. To communicate that, it should be broke down to simplistic things. Because when you walk out of the room, that you don't want to do a 3D representation of the journey you've just been on. You just want to be able to say to your handlers or whoever you've been working, your colleagues, okay, I found this or these things and all the rest of it. So I do think VR, I'll be honest, in my career, I've had 10 years police, 10 years in UK Gov, and I think that basically I see some applications for it, but we don't use it. I mean, it's not actively used. I mean, we're talking Excel most of the time. We're talking database programs most of the time. And we're talking and the other thing to think about this is that we are kind of also bound by academic and professional standards, aren't we? Because in academia, we say, okay, we'll test for significance. So we'll look at these two variables and see if they correlate. Or if by certain professional standards, we'll say, okay, well, we'll do a tree map of this and we'll look for. But I think when it comes to representation and visualization, I think at one side of the scale, we've got the full Star Trek holodeck or Matrix White Room. It'll be cool to have this kind of computer where we can say, look, draw me this, recreate that. I want to see X and Y. And it goes off into that's one end of the scale. And I think we'll get there. I think we could potentially get there now with some of the kit that's out there now, but not mainstream. It's now very tech and very niche. But the far other end of the scale, we've got it's the meme, isn't it? 3D pie charts. It's 3D, but it doesn't need to be 3D. It's meaningless decoration on something that's very straightforward. But I do think also, going back to being professionally and academically bound, that's the other thing, right? Is that it's going to be an interesting problem, isn't it? Even if you're an analyst, you have the most useful tool in the world, and you yield the most useful information. It's still quite a bold person that would say, well, I've ignored all these conventional techniques, and I've done this other technique, and I've found this. And I wonder to what extent that might threaten the outcome or the perceived judgment of that outcome. Does that make sense?
It does. A couple of points to pick up on. Firstly, I wonder, with all of our tools, they are necessarily limited by how they work. You can't do certain things with those tools. Now, the makers of those tools may not know that, or they may know it and choose not to tell you, because obviously they want you to buy their tools or use their tools. But understanding the limitations of the medium that you're using as an aid to thinking or communicating, for me, is part of the essential skill of an analyst. The second thing is they are limited in the kinds or forms or quantity of data that they can input. So again, that's a limitation. No matter how pretty or entertaining the visual product might be, if the data set is not correct or relevant, it's the classic situation of you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. One of the points that you brought up in terms of thinking process, I actually agree with you. These products may stimulate your thought processes, but it's likely that we, and I would do the same, would default to the most simplistic method, if only as a check and balance, because we've had the most faith based on our experience with those methods, and because they are simpler, by default, they are less likely to fail. There's less things to go wrong in them. And moving over to communication, be that with fellow analysts, but most importantly with customers, I have to say, in now 50 plus years, generating intelligence products for customers, the most effective product I have ever generated and I prefer to use is a face-to-face verbal report. Yes, it might be supplemented by other materials, be they charts or visualizations or written material or sample data sets, pieces of evidence. But that verbal communication goes right back to how human being A, as a primate, is designed to communicate with human being B or a group of human beings. It's the most effective route. I can convey emphasis, I can convey importance, I can convey my level of confidence and loads of other factors. And I can also read those in the person I'm communicating with or people I'm communicating with in that interaction. And I trust those skills, flawed though they are, like every human, we've talked about that, we've touched on it, far more than I would trust any other medium. It gives me the chance for the fail-safe where if I'm describing something, for argument's sake, I can see a member of the audience looking confused. They may say nothing, but if their non-verbal communication might suggest they're not understanding what I'm saying. I can stop and have that interaction with them to clarify it. And they may agree or disagree, or I may have misunderstood, but it's the best way to have checks and balances. I really worry, and always have done, and being concerned about generating a product that then you fire out into the ether, be it a written report, a recorded report, a PowerPoint, or a data visualization, some kind of more complex product that some third party looks at who weren't, even if they were the intended customer, they're not looking at it in the right context, in the right time frame, with the right approach. They're not able to have a two-way conversation with me in real time. And that's before we even get into what I call secondary and tertiary customers, where other people pick those things up and maybe compound that misunderstanding. So I agree with you. At the end of the day, stick to simple. Love the complex, play with it, acknowledge its risks, but the most effective intelligence and analytic products are going to be the simplest and those that are created by the most time-proven and experience-proven methods. Does that make sense?
It does. So I want to see if I can recap this into something people can take away from a utility point of view. So what we've kind of summarized is we've kind of said that before you even delve into VR and AR, you need to first consider that your own perception is a form of constructed reality. And you need to consider how that's going to impact on your analysis. The second thing we've said is that VR and AR are representational. So, and with any representation, there are things you can include and there are things you can exclude. And you have to be explicitly mindful of that because for all stuff you can gain, you can actually lose a lot of stuff as well. You can add more noise as well as signal. And I think we've also made a more broader point, which is that representationally, some things do require more representation than they get now. The 2D bar link chart isn't going to cut it, or sometimes you're going to have to add time or physical 3 dimensions to content, but it has to be part of a wider piece and it has to be considered in the context of what are you trying to achieve, where are the existing biases there, and how are you going to get something useful out the other end. Have I missed anything? Or has that kind of summarized most of what we were saying?
No, the other thing I would have included would be this understanding that there is a difference between what you might call visual thinking, virtual reality thinking, to drive your own thought processes and your own theorizing, and communicating in the same way with other people to actually transfer what your understanding is, correct or wrong, to a third party. But other than that, I think that's spot on.
Well, great talk. I think we'll probably wind it up there then. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you all again on the next episode of Think On.
Excellent.
Well done.